सुनते हैं सीधा हमने.
It went on for a few days in Parliament. Once we achieved the purpose, we allowed everything to proceed as it is. But here is the case: the proportionality of action has to be in relation to what the grievance that you are making. And therefore, when finally the debate was held on the last day, the charge of the principal opposition almost got laughed out. So if that is the gravity on which you hold up major reforms in the country, particularly when popular mood is entirely to the contrary. And this is a time in global economy when there is an important opportunity for India. India is doing reasonably well. It can embark on a much faster growth plan. And therefore, this is a time where, at least on issues on which parties speak the same language, everybody must get together rather than just to obstruct.
So given that context, do you see the GST being passed by and implemented by April next year, as you promised would be the case?
It's a legitimate question. It almost reflects my own desire and what I say. But when I see that the principal party in opposition, which doesn't even have figures on its side, the lower house, the Lok Sabha in India, reflects the popular mandate. It reflects an endorsement of the manifesto. The upper house to that extent doesn't, because it's elected by a different process altogether. And therefore, we are now living in a democracy where an indirectly elected house, and also there the numbers are on our side. If you count the parties which have supported the GST in the lower house and just tally their number, we have the two-thirds strength in the upper house. And therefore, the Congress party says, I will only shout down and not allow the session, because being a two-third vote on a constitution amendment, the vote has to be actually pressed through a button. I won't allow that to happen. Therefore, I would like to see it being implemented by 1st April. But if this kind of obstructionism remains, then perhaps the Congress party may succeed in hurting India, hurting India's economy, and allowing it to derail for some time. But GST is now being almost supported by everybody. Even the objections being raised, most of them I don't see much substance in it, but it's only a matter of time before it's passed.
Only a matter of time, but that sounds like we've come backwards. 6 months ago, or if you'd been at this summit a year ago, you would have said, definitely it'll be passed. Now you're saying in some time it'll be passed. This is the sort of language that I heard when I first came to India 5 years ago.
The difference between the two of us is that you only have to write an article. I have to make the house run. And I have to make the house run. And therefore, for the house to run, if I have an irresponsible bloc in the house, which says I won't allow the house to run, then Indian democracy will have to find out ways of tackling that situation.
But do you agree that the House hasn't been run particularly well in the last session? Because we've, yes, early on had reforms with insurance, the defence industry and so on, but in the last few months, you've reversed on the land bill, you've backed down, it seems,
let's be very clear. You must have a clear understanding of the land bill. Let me come to this. I have publicly said, and I maintain that even today, is probably one of the worst drafted, even in terms of legislative drafting, laws that I have seen. The draftsman intended something else, ended up producing something else. Now, it was drafted on the eve of the election. Every political party, after the election, unanimously all the state governments requested the centre, please bring about these amendments, otherwise the growth story will suffer a setback. We trusted the states. 2 of the Congress chief ministers actually wrote letters to the Prime Minister to that effect. Now we trusted them. This is an honest intention. We therefore brought about the laws which kept the enhanced compensations in place, which farmers are entitled to. And then whatever land is required for infrastructure, for rural development, and for further development, an economist's estimate, and land economists estimate, that for India to transform into a developed economy, you only need 1% of the entire agricultural land. You don't need more. So this was much ado about nothing. Now the same people who had been asking for the amendment now turned around and said, we will not allow this to happen. Now, in the land case, we have figures on our side, because unlike a constitution amendment, which can't be passed in a joint session because it has to be passed independently in both houses by a 2/3, this can be done by a joint session. The figures are on our side. Now, we called the chief ministers back again, and the chief minister said, it's a concurrent lit subject. The states can legislate, the center can legislate. Instead of allowing it to be held up in political obstructionism of some political parties, let the center assure us we'll make the amendments which every state needs according to its own requirements. Only central government assent is required. And we told them we'll give you assent. And therefore, it's not that you've gone back. You've decided to move forward by an alternative route, which is an easier route, and therefore the critics can just rejoice in the fact that they've tried to stop it at the center, but the same purpose is achieved by an alternate methodology.
So you wouldn't agree with the suggestion that your government has lost some momentum, that it hasn't been able to push through the sort of reforms that many people in this room would have expected to have seen by now?
I'll tell you, see, let's be first very clear. 9 out of 10 reforms require essentially executive action. Out of the balance 1, there's a large fraction which is always a part of what's known as the financial bills, where monies, appropriations are involved. Now, in all these actions, obstructionism doesn't work. It's only in those 1 or 2 cases, and those are the 1 or 2 cases that people like writing about or commenting, that they have an ability to hold up because a parliamentary backing is required. And let's be very clear, the figures in the upper house are also changing. We are now in the month of September, some 7 or 8 months down in the month of April 2016, there will be a significant change in the composition of the upper house also when the next round of biennial elections takes place. I always call it the creeping acquisition of the upper house.
But you talked about Achadin being here now. You talked about winning the last election being what was required to make India race again. Now you're talking about in a few years' time we might be able to do reforms. Do you think the expectations you built up were too high compared to the delivery that is possible?
The expectations we built up were legitimate and logical. And we live up to those expectations. What is important, particularly in adverse global circumstances, is that India must hold on to its own ground. India must continue to be on the reform path. Let's be very clear. In a reform path, there is never a finishing line. The race never ends. And therefore, you must go on and on because every day new issues come up which you have to tackle. You must never reverse the direction. And therefore, you must maintain your momentum. If there is an obstruction, you must still not yield to that obstruction and continue on the path, because it's only then that you are going to achieve that level of growth. Now, in a situation where, let's be very clear, today you are passing through a global phase, high volatility, slow growth rates, turmoil, and as I just told you before we entered the room, that we've entered a phase in economic management world over where there is not going to be an easy day. So if it's the Greek crisis one day, it is the devaluation, the competitive devaluations, the slowdown in China. Tomorrow it may be the uncertainty in the Fed rates. Day after, somewhere some banking challenges will emerge. And therefore, we have to stand our own ground and continue on that path and attain the place of one of the fastest growing economies in the world.
I think everyone in the room would agree with that, but we wouldn't necessarily agree with your characterization of never reversing, never yielding ground. I mean, I think of some of what we've already just discussed, the decision to back down on the land ordinance, other things such as the decision not to privatize airports, a failure to do anything like the NDA-1 did in terms of having a ministry of privatization.
Let's be very clear. I think you got it wrong on both counts. And why I say you got it wrong, on the land bill, we have an alternative cause. And you must be clear about it. Now, when you say airports, there's a if there is one sector in India where there has been reform even during the last government, and that's a momentum which we are continuing, even at the lesser level there has been a significant improvement, it's been the airports. Now there are two categories, two roads available as far as the airports are concerned. In some cases, you hand over the operations and management and the development of the airport. In a large number of cases, you've already developed those airports, including some of the airports. And don't forget, the Airport Authority of India, which has developed the Kolkata, the Chennai airports, had done it at a minuscule percentage of the cost at which some of the private sector companies have done. And therefore, that's also a model worth looking at. So in some of the other cases, you don't hand over the development, but you hand over the operations and management. And therefore, all these options, for instance, we have a separate model for the Kochi airport. We have a separate airport model for the Bangalore and the Hyderabad airport. We have a third model for the Delhi and the Mumbai airport. And now for some of the airports, we've decided where development has already taken place, that we may go in for a route of operation and management wherever it is possible. And some may continue to be managed. And the kind of profits you are getting into the airport sector, you are now investing it on the airfields which are not being developed, because we need a large number of airfields and more airports.
Can I ask you about a meeting yesterday that you were part of with Mr. Modi and various captains of industry? I think there's been some explanation of what was discussed in that meeting, but we'd love to know what were the complaints, what were the issues that were raised in that meeting from the industrial side, and what were the responses from the government?
Well, I think, first of all, let's get it clear, there were no complaints.
No complaints at all?
The only complaint that I heard, not as a complaint, but as a nudging suggestion, that now the private sector must also invest a little more. So that was just a nudging suggestion, it was not a complaint. Now, how do we deal with the situation? Now, it was an analysis which economists made, which bankers made, which captains of the industry made. And I must say all three were almost ad idem. They had the same viewpoint. The first analysis was, how does this turmoil impact us? Turmoils are going to continue. We are in an age of volatility at the moment. There was a general consensus on this. India seems to be holding its ground and must continue to hold its ground and must do better. And therefore, what are the steps that India must take? The bankers, for instance, pointed out some of the stressed sectors and said, we must take special effort to de-stress the stressed sectors. Now, in the stressed sectors, there is some activity which has started as far as infrastructure, particularly highways, was concerned. It was a highly stressed sector. That's moving positively. The next stressed sector is steel. Many people felt that steel is stressed essentially because of external factors, and therefore some defensive mechanisms must be set in place. It's a result of a huge amount of dumping coming into it. The third sector was power, particularly the problem of the discoms. And on discoms, already the banks, the Reserve Bank has taken a very positive initiative in telling those 3 or 4 states which have created a significant stress for the banking sector, that they must not now start charging for the power that they distribute. Otherwise, the banking system can't continue to fund them. Now, therefore, the bankers wanted to look at these sectors. The industry had its own suggestions to make. The economists and the industry suggestions were by and large common, not very different from the bankers. Concentration on 2 specific areas. Invest and invest even more in infrastructure. That will impact on your manufacturing eventually. Invest on irrigation, because the economy, general consensus was, the services are doing well, the manufacturing is now picking up, there are some big proposals coming, and 2 consecutive years of less than modest rainfall impacts not only agricultural production but also the purchasing power. And therefore, a huge amount of investment over the next few years has to go into irrigation, which will impact us, which will not only impact on agriculture but also on other sectors of the economy. Now, these were amongst the broad suggestions, plus there were a series of other suggestions with regard to some people spoke of interest rates, some people made some alternative suggestions, investing into education and the social sector. And therefore, these were all very positive suggestions which were coming in the meeting. Was there a complaint that this is what the government is not doing? I think everybody, including the government and the participants, had their feet on the ground, and therefore they know the reality of democracy and the costs of Indian democracy, that some decisions have their own dynamics of being concluded.
Let me pass along not a complaint, but a concern that I've heard about the banking system, that you've been too slow. You've been behind the curve on recapitalizing banks, on setting aside enough money to deal with the problem of the non-performing assets. There was a report in the newspaper this morning saying that 72% of bankers in a survey expect the problem of non-performing assets to get much worse in the coming months and years. Do you feel that the banking system is the biggest worry for the state of India's economy?
It's a matter of concern. It's not the main worry. There's no ground to panic. And it's a problem which is reasonably within sights of a solution. The banking system that we inherited, particularly the public sector banks, were actually in a very challenging situation. When the economy slows down, and when you inherit an economy at a sub 5% level growth rate, and which is extremely challenging for India, its impact on the banking sector is felt. I just now indicated to you 3 or 4 sectors which have actually added to the NPAs as far as the banks is concerned. How do you deal with this situation? One, the first thing that I found, and this is a response to your comment that are we slow, I found that the appointments of the heads of the banking system were not being professionally done. They were being done for collateral considerations. I had to take the unusual step of scrapping a number of appointments which were in the pipeline. We created a professional mechanism, which is a multi-layered interview system. We've taken people even from the private sector, segregated the post of the managing director and the chairperson. I've created a bank bureau where all appointments to the board, so that boards of banks now become more meaningful. Now that's as far as the management is concerned. As far as the question of day-to-day interference in government banks is concerned, the Prime Minister himself told the Gyan Sangam of the banks early this year that you'll never get a phone call from the government as to how to take your banking decisions. And if you ask any of the state sector banks, they'll probably evidence this. The next step that had to be done was to recapitalize the banks itself. We've come out with a detailed scheme. Over the next 4 years, even though there are fiscal pressures as far as the government revenues are concerned, I have earmarked a large amount of money from the government budgets in the first 2 years, that's this year and the next year. Then on a tapering basis, it goes down over the next 2 years. Plus, we've decided that the equity, as far as the government is concerned in the banks, can be brought down to 52%. When it comes down to 52%, the additional capital also goes into the recapitalization of the banks itself. So between the government equity, which we are now inducting, and over the next 2-3 years, whatever they get by sale of government, by larger equity, which brings down the government equity to 52%, we have a program in place as far as recapitalization of the banks are concerned. Additionally, we are looking at each of the sectors which are responsible for contributing to the major chunk of the NPAs as far as the banks are concerned. And the major sectors that I indicated to you are steel, are power, are state discoms, highways, to some extent textiles. Now these are the 5 major sectors. There are other smaller sectors which have contributed to it. We've addressed the highway issue in a big manner. I've used the falling oil prices to increase the cess, and a large part of the cess amount is being spent essentially on highways. And therefore, with the largest ever investment going into the highways and the railways at the moment, I think the highway sector has got moving. As far as DISCOMs are concerned, we are in touch with each of the states where the DISCOMs need to be reformed. And those states have been put adequately on notice. As far as the steel is concerned, we have to balance the interest of the consuming industry along with the steel manufacturing industry, because it's an external issue. So we've marginally increased our tariffs twice. We are looking and seriously examining other steps so that sectorally we can address the problem, which can be a defensive mechanism against dumping of the steel as far as the country is concerned. So the idea is to look at the banks for a solution and to look at the sectors which are responsible for the NPAs.
But what I didn't hear you say there, but that there was any intention to take some of those bad debts from those 5 sectors and park them separately to create what's sometimes called a bad bank.
These are functional issues. How the banking industry will decide to deal with the assets, whether they follow the asset reconstruction route, whether they follow the takeover of management, transfer of those companies. Now, all these options are open. I have even gone to the extent of saying that if there is a bank which is fragile, after all these changes, my first object is to strengthen these banks. After that, if there is a fragile bank, I'm open to looking even at consolidation with the stronger banks. So it's not that banks don't get a priority. In fact, having inherited a legacy of banks in a very fragile situation, we are systematically trying to address each of those banking issues.
Okay. Let me ask you about trade. I had expected that perhaps when Mr. Modi goes around the world and talks to other countries about the need to do business with India, that India would be much more enthusiastic about doing a trade deal, for example, with the European Union, or to reach out to other parts of Asia. And yet there hasn't been much movement on this. In fact, your government cancelled some talks with the European Union recently. Do you feel you're sending the right message to the world on this score?
You see, as far as trade deals are concerned, deals are not undertaken merely because it's part of economic diplomacy. Trade deals are done after a detailed process of discussion and dialogue. And after a process of discussion and dialogue, when you reach a consensus that it's a mutually beneficial arrangement between the two economies, you culminate into the trade deal. We've entered into a large number of trade deals. But entering indiscriminately into trade agreements and then having concerns a few years later is not the wise thing. I think it's better to move carefully but surely.
But isn't there a risk that the rest of the world races ahead? You have trade deals between China, America, TTP, or whatever, and you want to do manufacturing that requires trade.
Of course we require trade, we require manufacturing, and therefore India is not going to lag behind as far as trade deals are concerned. We are certainly going to look at trade deals which are mutually beneficial to both the trading partners. Trade deal merely because it's a part of economic diplomacy is not essential. Trade deal because it benefits both economies is essential.
So it doesn't sound like a great sense of urgency.
वित्त मंत्री इकोनॉमिस्ट के एक कार्यक्रम में